Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Happy Monday to you. Thank you for listening, whether it's on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com, or wherever you podcast. It was a couple of Thursdays ago on the 21st at Howard University that Howard and TheHill.com hosted a Black Women in Politics special event, which featured Representative Joyce Beatty, Whitley Yates, Director of University and Engagement for the Indiana Republican Party, and also Stacey Abrams from right here in Georgia, former state representative and gubernatorial candidate. Moderated by Cheyenne Daniels, who is the race and politics reporter at The Hill. Thought I'd give you an opportunity to listen to Stacey appearing at that event. Here we go.
Joining me now is the Ronald W. Walters Endowed Chair of Race and Black Politics at Howard University. She was also the first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the United States. I'd like to welcome Stacey Abrams. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I am well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we are here to talk about Black women in politics. And as we get started, I want to ask you the same question that I started our panel with, which is, do you feel that we are accurately represented in our political world right now?
Not at all.
No.
Part of representation is power. It is not only having the numbers, but it's having the ability to translate those numbers into lived experience, into policymaking. And we live in a time where Black maternal mortality is at an extraordinary level. We live in a moment where our tax policies do not reflect the realities of our labor cycle. We live in a moment where the denial of access to health care is incredibly persistent in the region of the country where 56% of African Americans live, which means Black women are being denied access to health care. And we live in a moment where this is the first generation to actually lose constitutional rights since Reconstruction. And for women of color, for Black women in particular, the loss of bodily autonomy is dangerous to our economic future, our educational future, and it is an assault on our civil rights. And so, no, I do not believe that we are adequately represented.
You know, one of the things that we often hear when we think about representation is we think about the federal level. We think about our White House, we think about our Senate and the House of Representatives, but how important is representation at our state and local levels?
I began my political work at the local level. I was actually deputy city attorney for the city of Atlanta. And it was that experience that actually led me to run for state legislature, in part because I saw a mayor who attempted to solve hyper-local issues, often being thwarted by a state government that did not respect her responsibilities. We know that there is an intentional devolution of power from the federal to the state level. Again, it has been most acute when it comes to the issue of abortion and bodily autonomy, but it's happening across the board. That means that if you want to understand what is changing the policies or constraining your access to opportunity, it is at the state level. There is a bit of a stalemate at the congressional level. And so our opportunities for change, for power, for access will happen at the state and local levels. And again, because I live in the South, I'm always thinking about the fact that more than half of the African American population, a fairly sizable number of people of color live in the South, and that is the place where the state policies are the most constrained, the most restrictive, and unfortunately now the most intentionally damaging. We just saw what happened in Alabama. We saw what happened in Kentucky. Attacks on civil rights, attacks on our human rights are becoming more and more prevalent, and those are happening at the state level.
Mm-hmm. We all know how important voting rights are for you. So I want to take a moment to talk about why voting, especially for Black women, is so important, and just the power of Black women voters.
Absolutely. So I often say, voting is not magic. Voting is medicine. Magic, you do it once, ta-da, things are done. It doesn't work that way. Voting is medicine. There are ills in our society. There are challenges that we face. And we need to take the medicine to ameliorate the consequences to make us better. But sometimes the medicine is bitter. Sometimes it feels worse than the actual malady that you face. But part of taking medicine is that you've got to do it over and over and over again, because when you stop, often whatever you're facing will metastasize and get worse. And so we have to consistently engage in voting, because voting in and of itself is not the point. It's not about who's on the ballot. It's about who's in the booth. It's about which people are making the choices and how do our lives improve. Because we live in a democracy, because we live in a nation where we elect people to make choices on our behalf, we can't hope that they'll do the right thing once we put them in office. That's like giving someone, putting someone in charge of your store, giving them the keys to the cash register and saying, I'm going to leave for 4 years. Please don't steal anything. And please don't give your friends free stuff. Don't take anything. And I'll be back in 4 years to check on you, but I won't look at anything you've done. I'm just going to make sure that if the store hasn't burned down, I'm going to let you stay. We wouldn't do that in any other place but our politics. And so for me, voting is about how we not only have accountability, but it's also how we demand access to our rights and our responsibilities. When we treat voting as an activity, then it's something it's one and done. I think of it as an action. It is something you do over and over again. And the more we do it, the better we get at it, the better we see the outcomes for the lives we want to lead.
When we think about voter suppression, which we know is a huge top of mind issue for folks at the federal level, like our Congressional Black Caucus, to those at our state and local levels, we know that there is a huge push for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to be passed. We know that voter suppression disproportionately affects Black voters. So a little bit of a controversial question, but are Black voters dangerous?
The question presumes that the outcomes don't benefit everyone. When Black people vote, when we have seen engagement and opportunity, we have seen progress for everyone. Think about Reconstruction. That was a time of economic surplus for a nation coming out of a war, when we finally allowed African Americans to fully participate, even for a brief moment. We saw dramatic changes. We saw incredible improvements. We have seen that the locus of power often shifts away from those who can demand the most access and the widest aperture for others. And so to the extent that your intention is to restrict and deny, then the answer could be that this is not a group that you want. But if your goal is actually improving the lives of everyone, then Black participation in voting is absolutely essential. I remind people that we have to remember our votes aren't just our voice, they are an instrument of power. And voter suppression happens in subtle and obvious ways. In the prior to the Voting Rights Act, it was very obvious. Now it's become much more subtle, although they're revealing themselves more often. But voter suppression is, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And does that ballot get counted? And so anytime you see any new legislation around voting, any new regulatory schemes, ask yourself, are they restricting your right to register or stay on the rolls? Are they creating any barriers to your ability to cast a ballot? Are they guaranteeing or undermining the ability for your ballot to get counted? That's voter suppression. It is no longer counting beans in a jar. It's shutting down polling places, restricting who can vote by mail. It is making decisions that limit your ability to be heard. And the reason they want you to be silent is because what you say is incredibly powerful. When we show up, we show a difference, and that's why our voices are so important.
I want to pivot very briefly, because when you were a student at Spelman, you had gone to the board of trustees over tuition hikes. And I don't know if you remember talking about this experience, but you said when you were reflecting on it that we have to stop waiting for people to ask for our opinion. Can you just talk a little bit about why that idea of waiting for somebody to ask us what we think is so important, especially when it comes to Black women?
So as a student at Spelman, I was on scholarship. I availed myself of all financial aid. And I found out tuition was going up, but they weren't increasing my scholarship. I wasn't going to be able to access a higher Pell Grant that year. And somebody was going to have to come up with the money, and I didn't have it. And so the instinct for a lot of my colleagues in college, it was simply to grin and bear it. But for me, it was an existential crisis. My education was on the line. And I'd grown up in a family where my parents taught us, we had 3 jobs: go to church, go to school, and take care of each other. But what underlined all of that was your obligation to speak up. That you could not hope that someone would speak for you. Telepathy doesn't work. I've been practicing for 50 years. It has not happened yet. And so if you don't speak up and demand what you need, if you don't speak up, especially for those who don't know they have the right to be heard, things don't change. And so for me, the conversation about democracy, about voting rights, about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these are all about how do we make certain that we are heard. If we wait to be invited to take our power, I promise the invitation is not in the mail. But if we demand our place, if we seize our opportunities, or in my case, and I think for so many, if we create our own opportunities, that's how we start to generate the change that we need to see.
When I think about where we are right now, as I'm sure all of us are intimately aware of, is that we've never had a black female governor in this country. We've had only 3 black governors ever, all of them male, the most recent one being Governor Wes Moore being elected. But at the same time, I think about the strides that we as black women have made when we think about Vice President Kamala Harris, when we think about Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Where is our line? Where do we have to say we still want more? Do we get to keep wanting more for those who are like, well, you're in the White House, you're in the Supreme Court, what more do you need?
We need as much as we can hold. That's our creed de core. That's what we should be demanding. Our place in this society should be equal to anyone else's. The reason I'm so passionate about democracy, but also why I'm so proud of the work I was able to do as a candidate, was that me standing for office was not just about getting a job. It would have been lovely to have the job. But it was also about who could see themselves also asking for that power, who could see themselves also demanding the right to move into a position, to demand that promotion, to simply get the respect they are entitled to. I want to see more of us because we should see that we are more than the least common denominator. And too often we are relegated to the worst stereotype, or even worse, we are ignored. Our engagement in this society, our responsibility as black women in politics, is to make politics work for everyone. And those who have faced the worst examples of bad politics are the ones who are best prepared to make it the most effective means of advancement and improvement. Ultimately, we are all in search of the American dream, and we can define that dream as we see fit. But we can't get there if we don't remove the barriers. And there is no one better to remove the barriers than the person who ran into it. And so for me, black women in politics is about how we lift this entire nation. And so no, I don't think we've gotten... I am proud of every single person you named, but I know that the fact that you can name them is the problem. We should be legion, and we should be so plentiful and so powerful that we are simply accepted as the right thing to do.
When I think about some of the conversations that are happening right now, particularly I'm thinking of Nicole Hannah-Jones and her recent essay in the New York Times about color blindness being a trap. And if you haven't read the essay, I highly recommend it. But with that in mind, when we're looking at, as you mentioned, I can name these women, right? And that in and of itself is vaguely problematic that we can count them off on our 2 hands. Will there come a day, or should there come a day, where we're able to say your gender, your race doesn't matter to be able to represent? Or do we want to keep that in mind in order to say, but I know those barriers and what we had to overcome?
A few years ago, I wrote an essay for the Council for Foreign Affairs on identity politics. Identity politics is perfectly acceptable unless they don't like your identity. And when we hear about class, when we hear about women, when we hear about business, those are all identities. Why are our identities any less relevant? Representation matters because representation is the avatar for understanding what preceded that moment. If you don't understand what's wrong, you cannot make it right. Therefore, representation is absolutely important. And there should never be a moment where representation is diminished. The question is, how much power should it have because there's so much difference in what you get? So our issue should not be the fact that people cling to identity. It's the fact that we allow identity to distinguish your access to power. That's why the fight over DEI is so important. Right now, there is this very reductive narrative that DEI is this recent phenomenon on college campuses that has to be stamped out. DEI describes every single movement we have had since the Revolutionary War. Any opportunity to move this country forward, Reconstruction, suffrage, the Chicano movement, the disability movement, the LGBTQIA movement, the labor movement, those are all diversity, equity, and inclusion movements that exist because that's how we make our country better. Our representation matters because it's the way we get to the American dream that we've all been told we are entitled to. So either we change the ethos of this nation or we change the process that makes it so. And my intention is to change the process. That's why I work so hard to make certain we can all vote, that we can participate, and irrespective of who we vote for, you should have the right to be heard. But representation in that is absolutely essential because you cannot solve problems you don't acknowledge. And more importantly, you won't solve the next problem if you don't have the experience of having solved one before.
Former state representative and Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams speaking at the Hills and Howard University's Black Women in Politics Forum. Cheyenne Daniels there, the race and politics reporter for The Hill, moderating that. She takes some questions from some students. I'll give you a few of those when the Ron Show returns. She touches on Georgia topics, Medicaid expansion, for example, when the Ron Show returns on the American One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, or wherever you podcast. If you follow The Ron Show, by the way, on Facebook or Instagram, you may have seen my plea for donations. Only because this show has been an out-of-pocket expense for yours truly since I launched it 16 months ago. I consciously have made an effort to not make this an over-commercialized production because I believe the conversation, the dialogue is so important. Now, this show airs on America One Radio, the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com. That is, I guess, in essence, it would be a for-profit venture, except, again, America One Radio is essentially an out-of-pocket expense for Jeremy Persil and the staff there. And so, maybe one day it'll be for-profit, but as of currently, I think we're all just sort of working hard to get the conversation out here, the dialogue, something from a progressive and liberal left-of-center perspective. Of course, we try here at the show to be fact-based and data-driven and to provide an opportunity, a safe space for the sort of dialogue that isn't being had in the audio, particularly the radio spectrum. So I'm asking you, if you enjoy this show routinely, whether it be via podcast or from America One Radio or even on demand at progressivevoices.com, if you get the chance to, would so be appreciative of you helping to keep this show going. You can visit ronshowatl.com. There is a donate tab at the top of the page. It'll lead you right to our PayPal page, and you can help keep this passion project going, where we focus on Atlanta and Georgia and domestic and even international politics from a left-of-center point of view. All right. Stacey Abrams spoke a couple of Thursdays ago at the Black Women in Politics Forum at Howard University, sponsored by The Hill. And let's get back to where she got to answer some questions from some students who were there to hear her speak.
Hello, my name is Camila Armas. I'm a freshman political science major from Howard University. And my question is that there was a lot of hope for the Biden administration and the Congress coming into 2020 in terms of making positive policy change. And a lot of people are disappointed in the seeming lack of results. So where does policy change that will most affect the issues Black women and other minorities face happen? On a local and state level, or is there still hope for the national level coming into 2024? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I would say that we have seen dramatic improvements because I want us to remember what 2020 was like. I know a lot of us want to forget, but 2020 was hard. And since that time, we have seen dramatic action, not only on climate change, on attempts to make sure we expand job opportunities, on health care. We had a child tax credit that got taken away. So what we've got to remember is what was and then what disappeared. There were moments that were instituted by the Biden administration and by that Congress, that when the congressional makeup changed, those changes disappeared. And so we cannot eschew federal engagement, and we should always hold to the reality that even though we get what we want, the other side gets what they want too. And so it's a constant tension, and our obligation is to make sure we're a little bit further ahead than the other guys. So my very strong sentiment is that we've had a successful administration that can't get everything done because there's a lot to do, which is why they're asking for 4 more years. But putting that aside, what we also cannot do is think that every problem gets solved at the federal level. That is why my focus is so assiduously on state politics, because we know that for most Americans, the choices about education, about the economy, and about elections is not federal. It's actually state. It's either because of a stalemate at the federal level or because they've already devolved that power to the state and local governments. And so we've got to have a both and approach, both state and local and federal. But when we decide to focus on one to the exclusion of the other, the people who are fighting against our advancement are going to take the power of that other space and use it against us. So we've got to look everywhere all the time.
A couple of more questions for Stacey Abrams when the Ron Show returns.
Want to be on the show? Have a cause or campaign you'd like to speak up for? Email Ron at ronshowatl.com or call 404-919-2725. The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Thank you for listening, and we are listening back from a couple of Thursdays ago, the 21st of March, actually, when Stacey Abrams, former Georgia State Representative and gubernatorial candidate, will she be again in 2026? We shall wait and see. Anyway, she spoke at the Howard University, thehill.com's Black Women in Politics Symposium. And we have a couple of more sound bites where we have questions from students in the audience. And she touches on Medicaid expansion or lack thereof here in the state of Georgia in one of those responses. Let's take a listen.
Hi.
I see you too, so go ahead and stand behind her because you keep popping up and down.
Hi, my name is Taylin Sharp. I'm a student at Georgetown University, and I'm also with Codex. I have a question. You focus heavily on grassroots and local politics. Can you expand on some of the obstacles that Black women find in running for local politics, and can you expand on the importance of Black women in these roles? Thank you.
Absolutely. Black women have to be represented at every level of politics because we live at every level of lives. Like we don't simply exist in the federal ether. We do not simply exist in the federal ether, and therefore we have to pay attention to what's happening to our children or to ourselves in an educational setting. That's local politics. We have to understand what's happening with bodily autonomy. That's state politics. We have to know who gets access to funding for capital, for our jobs, and for the businesses we want to start. That's state and local and federal. We've got to pay attention to the constraints on our ability to grow our opportunities. That happens at all levels. And so I start at the grassroots because when you can create the strongest team, those teams then send up your players. I mean, it's kind of like a farm team. Sorry, I use a lot of sports analogies. But if you only have one person at the local level, that person may not make it all the way up. That's why you need as many as possible starting at the most easily accessible level, but it's only easily accessible if there are resources. It's hard for Black women to raise money, in part because it's hard for Black women to ask for money. It's hard to make it through the political systems that give you the right to know that you can ask for money. I operate in a space where I just don't ask for permission. And sometimes I ask for forgiveness, but even that sometimes. Part of it is that we've got to own our authority to do what needs to be done without needing other people to say it's the right thing to do. And so we should run for office when there's an office open, but we should also help our friends run for those offices. And we have to lower our barriers to entry where we expect you to be perfect before you start. If they can learn on the job, so can we. And we can learn at each level of the job. And it's not just about who's holding the office. It's who's the chief of staff, who's making the phone calls, who's writing the press releases. Because the way we tell our stories often determine how our stories are heard. And so we've got to build not just the candidates for local office. My grassroots work has focused not only on who's running, but who's running the campaign, who's running the staff, and who's running their mouth when you are not in the room. And if you think about all of those places, that's how we grow our capacity to run for everything and one day run everything.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Gabrielle Draper. I'm a senior psychology and political science student at Howard. And my question kind of revolves around the mental health aspect. I read recently in a book by Congressman Raskin that if you don't have constituents who are well, you're not going to have constituents who are voting. And so I'm curious as to how, in your work to promote more engagement in voting on the state level, really at every level, but how can we address the mental health aspect and really give people just the self-autonomy to actually get to the polls themselves and really know that their vote matters?
So I think there are two component pieces to that, and I appreciate the question. One is a structural issue. Again, I reference the South a lot because it is emblematic of so many of the broken pieces that we have in our infrastructure. The absence of Medicaid expansion in southern states means that millions of people are denied access to mental health care, because embedded in the Affordable Care Act and therefore in Medicaid expansion is access to that mental health support. Coming out of COVID, out of the pandemic, there was never a more acute moment than the proof that we needed holistic health care, and yet an entire region of the country is continuing to deny access. And so we've got to demand that our governments actually provide access. I live in a state, the state of Georgia, that is willing to spend $26 million to provide access to 3,000 people, 3,500, let me give them credit, as opposed to accepting billions of dollars to serve more than 500,000 people. It is a decision that is a disgrace, and the mental health component is absolutely a key reason that we have to make certain that healthcare is expanded across this country to everyone. And then there's just the daily trauma of living. And part of what I tell folks when you're trying to engage voters, lectures don't work. No one has ever been lectured into action. You just do it because you're tired of hearing it. But the lecture itself is not what creates the change. But our job is not to lecture. Our job is to ask, how can I help? What is hurting you? What do you need? If you want to convert someone from non-voting to voting, or if you want to change their vote from one side to the other, ask them what they need and then listen to their answers and help them find solutions. My teams, whenever I run for office and whenever I'm in office, their job is to say, how can I help first and foremost? Because if you start with that, you create a sense of empathy, but also you create an action-oriented behavior. I can help you, but I need you to help yourself by showing up to make certain that I'm in a position of power to make that help real.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And I want to give a big thank you to you for joining us today. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Stacey Abrams, Ronald W. Walters Endowed Chair of Race and Black Politics at Howard University. Thank you so much.
Stacey Abrams speaking at the Black Women in Politics Symposium hosted at Howard University with thehill.com. Stacey actually made a little bit of she can't claim the headline, but Fareed Zakaria invoked Stacey Abrams over the weekend. I didn't know this, by the way. CNN is now airing Real Time with Bill Maher after it airs, I guess, on HBO Max and on HBO. Just happened to be sitting around Saturday night watching some television and saw it on and thought, okay, that's odd. Let's see how they do this. Being a former broadcast guy, I love seeing how something made for pay cable translates to, and they didn't edit much. I think the F-bomb even went out on CNN. Okay. Nonetheless, the conversation pivoted towards the Ronna McDaniel firing at NBC, and Fareed Zakaria evoked Stacey Abrams as an election denier. I'm going to read to you a summation from Deadline.com. They used NBC's firing of former Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel as a starting point to discuss the alienation of the country and its role in the political divide. Zakaria wondered how much McDaniel should be punished for her prior election denials, views she's since recanted. Zakaria saying Stacey Abrams was an election denier about her own election, he pointed out, and said that you can't, quote, deplatform 85 million Americans. Mark Esper, who used to serve on Trump's cabinet, agreed and marveled that the NBC on-air staff seemed to lead the charge against McDaniel and wondered aloud who was in charge, the on-air hosts or corporate leadership. The conversation then turned toward liberalism. The classic old school liberals are being smothered by the woke agenda, as Bill Maher has been noted to posit quite a bit in the last few years. Fareed Zakaria agreeing. When liberals go overboard with this puritanical zeal, it produces a backlash. You can see it in the French Revolution. The woke wave extends beyond politics into movies which are concerned with, quote, how many people of color are in this? Can't we just do a great Hamlet? Liberalism in the classic sense, quote, is about seeing people as individuals, he said. This Deadline article continues. The effect of wokeism on the military was raised by Maher, who asked Mark Esper whether its overuse in the armed forces is threatening our readiness, to which Esper replied, it's not as bad as the right would say, but it's worse than the left would acknowledge. The focus on it is taking time away from more important functions, Esper said, and undermines morale by subdividing the units. The Deadline piece sort of wraps on that conversation, saying that all agree that Biden has allowed wokeism to flourish because he doesn't want to fight with that wing of his party. I'll touch on the wokeism stuff here in just a little bit. Anyway, Stacey Abrams had an opportunity to speak about the premise that she is an election denier 2 years ago. I don't know if Fareed saw this interview, but Marquis Francis with NBC News got to ask her about comparisons to the 2020 insurrection and Trump, who, by the way, is still on trial for trying to overturn results, specifically in Georgia and throughout the rest of the country as well. Marquis Francis with NBC News got to ask Stacey about the premise that her not conceding in 2018 is akin to Donald Trump's antics since 2020.
Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger last October wrote an op-ed and said, basically, because you did not concede in the election for governor the first time around, people are now losing faith in Georgia's election process, and it even gave way for what Trump did. Do you think that's fair?
Not at all. The difference is very stark. When I did not win my election in 2018, the first thing I said was that I acknowledged the outcome, that the new governor was Brian Kemp. I was not the governor. But I did say the system was broken. And Republicans agreed. They passed laws in the very next legislative session fixing many of the issues that we pointed out.
Yep.
They then didn't do more that needed to be done, so we took them to court. And unfortunately, in January of 2021, they decided to retrench because they didn't like the outcome of the next election. I've never once sued to make myself the governor, not once. But I have sued to make certain that every Georgian has equal access to the polls, that they have the right to vote. And it is deeply concerning to me that a Secretary of State doesn't understand the difference between the lies being told by Donald Trump and the truth that Republicans acknowledged in the complaints that we raised about the electoral system in Georgia.
And so a lot of people like to be hung up on that concession, but do you regret not conceding at all?
I know what I said. I acknowledge that he won, but I will never say that a system that is broken, that denied people their right to vote, is the right thing to have in a state. Part of democracy, part of the First Amendment, part of who we are as Americans is that we have the right to challenge systems. Challenging a system isn't the problem. It is when you refuse to be a part of the solution or when you lie about what the challenges are. The lawsuit that our organization brought, that Fair Fight brought, took 4 months because of the number of witnesses that we had that the courts needed to see. So I'm very comfortable saying that the system that we challenged indeed had problems, continues to have issues, and I am proud that I was a part of pushing that forward. Language matters, and I was very careful in what I said in my speech. I've been very careful every day since. And the fact that one person wants to misconstrue what I've said in order to bolster his own belief system is it's not my fault, but I will say this. I hope that people don't give Brad Raffensperger credit, because this is a man who with one breath is getting credit for not committing treason, but he was also the architect of SB 202 that is denying people use of drop boxes, that's denying people the equitable use of absentee ballots, is making it difficult for people to navigate the system, and is creating a pathway for election subversion. Those are truths, and this is an objective conversation that we have to have. If people find it difficult to vote, we need to do better, and my mission is to make it better.
We know it's a fact. Republicans are making it harder for people to vote, right? Especially here in Georgia. And like you mentioned, with SB 202 reduced the number of ballot boxes, but at the same time, there was a record number of people turning out in the primaries. And so I know you famously called it Jim Crow 2.0. And so do you feel as though the voting rights law was as bad as you said it was?
Absolutely. So let's understand, primaries are a snapshot. And we have seen increased participation in elections year over year in the state of Georgia. But the metric they're using is the wrong metric. Voter suppression isn't designed to stop all voting. It is designed to create barriers for some voters. And those voters indeed face barriers. They will still face barriers, especially in the general election. But the more reductive way to put it is, just because more people get in the water, it doesn't mean there are fewer sharks. Those barriers are there. And as more people try to vote, they're going to face those barriers. The minute we get distracted by record turnout, we ignore the fact that if you are disabled, it is more difficult for you to cast a ballot now because it is more difficult to use the absentee ballot system. And this is not coming from me. This is coming from disability advocates. If you are a student trying to cast a vote, it is more difficult for you to guarantee that your absentee ballot makes it home if you can't, because you live in Columbus and you're going to school in Atlanta. We have to recognize that voter suppression is targeted, it is real, and it is going to be even more difficult because of SB 202.
I have a lot of respect for Fareed Zakaria. I have watched him for many years, Fareed Zakaria GPS, and just watching, first of all, I've noticed the old man get off my lawn lurching lean of Bill Maher over the years, which sort of disappoints me as well because I used to be a huge fan of his. Watched that show routinely, and I, again, was sort of surprised to see it on CNN, so I didn't plan to watch it, but did watch it. But seeing Fareed Zakaria, and he is such an eloquent, thought-provoking pundit, to see him just lob Stacey Abrams out as an election denier in such simplistic terms, really disappointing, because he's a really smart guy. And to just throw a bumper sticker phrase out there without much depth behind it, very disappointing. You can follow The Ron Show on your preferred social media platforms, that is, at Ron Show ATL, Instagram and Facebook, Twitter X. A few of them you're seeing me reminding you that this show has been mostly a labor of love, and when you listen, you don't hear a whole lot of commercial interruptions, especially within the show, because I try and keep this to the content. I get 44 and a half minutes each day. Thanks to our friends at America One Radio, AmericaOneRadio.com, giving us the platform when we air 9 to 10 a.m. weekdays and then 5 to 6 p.m. with the replay. So we try to stick to that format. We also air on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com, which you can hear completely uninterrupted by commercials. And I try and make that the case because, again, 44 and a half minutes each day is just a snapshot of what's going on. When we're covering Atlanta and Metro Atlanta, Georgia, U.S., and international politics from a liberal and progressive perspective. So you see that there's the opportunity now, if you'd like, to head to ronshowatl.com, drop a little donation via PayPal, and you don't have to have a PayPal account. You can actually just go right to your debit or credit card if you'd like to and make a donation. This has been an out-of-pocket expense for yours truly for about 16 months since the show launched, and I would reckon that we've spent probably about $3,500 or so. I mean, I'm not seeking that back, but every little bit adds up over time. Equipment expenses, time doing this takes me away from other ventures. Again, I'm a residential real estate agent, and so the equipment I mentioned, the website that costs money, the Dropbox, got to have the file folder large enough to hold all these audio segments so that they get to Progressive Voices and get to America One Radio. These are all out-of-pocket expenses. And so if you enjoy the show, and you enjoy the show on the routine for you, whether it's weekdays in your podcast menu, or you listen to America One Radio or ProgressiveVoices.com, and you find it within your heart to help facilitate some of the costs incurred on this show, then please, by all means, I would welcome you contributing. Again, you can go to ronshowatl.com. There's the donate tab at the top of the site. I wanted to talk a little bit about the anti-wokeism bent. We see this obviously from the right, a given, but now starting to see it from some of our left of center and even center voices. Again, I mentioned Fareed Zakaria. on with Bill Maher. Mark Esper, you can expect that from. He's a former Trump cabinet official. But you're starting to see it again, not just from the center and center-right, but hearing it from the voices like Bill Maher. Can it be a little concerning? Listen, I think it's important for us on the left to have this conversation about our extremes, because those on the right aren't going to have the conversations that they should be having about their extremes. They don't want to discuss it. We on the left are at least discussing it. It's interesting that when someone like Bill Maher, who has quite the resume, he's done a lot of things over the years. He's been an actor. He's been a stand-up comedian. He's been a pundit of sorts. And, of course, he hosts his show, Real Time with Bill Maher, for what are we looking at now? Like more than 11 seasons, something like that? He has a lot to his credit. So when you, for example, decide you want to have Bill Maher on your show, if I were to have him on my show and I introduced him as stand-up comic Bill Maher, do you think he might take offense to me not mentioning all the other things that he's done over the years? He might. He might. And that, to me, is something I would say to a Bill Maher to compare to anyone who bristles against preferred pronouns or identity. It's pretty easy to remember as a heterosexual white male that identity does matter to those who wish to have their identity acknowledged, when it's not necessary when you're a heterosexual white male. You don't have to worry about your preferred pronouns. You don't have to worry about the bathrooms you're going to. And by the way, the bathroom conversation to me just cracks me up. I was actually at a lesbian bar yesterday doing a fundraiser for my softball league. They have 2 restrooms. They don't genderize either restroom. Now, I will say this, because the building that they're in has the plumbing that they do, in one restroom, there are stalls and there are urinals. It's pretty easy to note which ones someone who identifies as a female can and cannot use. And even if you identify as a male and you can't use a urinal, you have the stall. I identify as a male. I'm a he, him. I can use the stall if I want to. And you know what? Little secret, y'all. Sometimes I'm at home, and even if I only need to go number 1, I'm tired. It's my toilet. I can sit. I don't understand this issue. I really don't. We stop at gas stations all the time, right? Where there's only one bathroom. Do you stop to wonder if it's meant for males or females, or do you just use it because you got to use it? And really, that's all anybody has time for. Listen, I'm a 50-year-old white male. I am getting to an age where I have to stop sometimes and catch my breath when it comes to the latest wave of progressivism or liberalism, and understanding where a younger generation is coming from. And instead of just openly dismissing it, I try to hear it out and I try to understand. And I at least acknowledge that when somebody wishes to be identified a certain way, that's what they get. That's the respect they're deserving of. And it's the respect that I seek every day as well when somebody introduces me in whatever form they wish to introduce me at. Because I'm not only a podcast host, I'm a residential real estate agent. Actually, I pay dues so I can actually ask or insist that people call me a realtor. I'm not going to insist because I think that's kind of arrogant. It's just me paying dues after all. I'm also a business development liaison for my softball league. But I'm not going to sit here and get upset if you miss any of that. And I'm also not going to bristle when somebody wants acknowledgement for all that they've accomplished or all that they recognize themselves to be as well. And I don't think that's really a hard ask. I don't understand the pushback. From the center and the center right, of course, but from the left, it's deeply concerning. All right, that's going to do it for today. We do replay this again, 5 to 6 p.m. on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com. It replays in its entirety and without commercial interruptions on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com. You can hear it on repeat via podcast on your preferred podcast platform when you search and like and subscribe to The Ron Show. And I do have show notes, usually, I don't think I have many today, at RonShowATL.com. Or I'll see you tomorrow, 9 to 10 a.m. on America One Radio. Have yourselves a great day. We'll see you then.